The NFL draft begins 1 week from today, and the Jets are going to answer plenty of questions. Questions we'll ask today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, April 18th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have the competitive side, and it's a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Well, the NFL draft just 1 week away from getting underway. Next Thursday night, Jets currently on the 10th overall pick, and they will answer plenty of questions we have right now, questions that we're going to ask on today's episode about what the Jets will do with that pick. Now, I think that we can say with some degree of confidence that the Jets are probably going to pick a player on the offensive side of the ball. You know, it's probably going to be an offensive lineman, a wide receiver, or Georgia tight end Brock Bowers. That's where the smart money is focused right now. And of course, it's always possible the Jets could throw a curveball. Last year, I don't think any of us thought Will McDonald was going to be the pick in the first round for the New York Jets. But there are some questions about what the Jets will do with this pick. And one of the questions is whether the Jets will stay with the 10th overall pick. Now, I think it's always smart to bet on a team staying where it is. Most teams do not trade up or trade down, but you could see a scenario where the Jets do either this year. And part of it might have to do with the question of the Jets being all in. And it's practically a cliche at this point. It's something we can kind of laugh about because everybody say the Jets are all in. Jets are like the ultimate win now team right now. And there's a lot of truth to that. Jets have an older roster. Jets have a 40-year-old quarterback leading that older roster. And, you know, there are old players all over the place. You know, 2 of the 5 oldest starting tackles in the NFL. You know, we could go through the roster. Jets also have a shortage of draft picks. And the Jets also have a tight cap situation. So, you know, we're probably looking at some sort of reset in the next year or two with the Jets. And hopefully, you know, you hope it's going to be a soft landing. But Jets are really focused on the here and now. And I think one question you can ask is how in is all in? Because there's a school of thought out there that the Jets are really all in, and that means they need to move up. That means they should be looking to trade up and get as good of a prospect as they can, get a prospect who's as highly regarded as they can. So you've seen in recent mock drafts, and of course mock drafts are just prognostications, but there have been some recent mock drafts that have suggested the Jets may trade up to get a premium prospect. You know, could it be a Marvin Harrison Jr.? Could it be a Joe Alt? Harrison is the top wide receiver, kind of the consensus top receiver in this year's draft. Alt is the consensus top tackle. And it's kind of odd to put it in the context, especially a move up for a top draft pick in the context of all in or short-term thinking, because you're drafting a young player. You're drafting a guy who's going to be a rookie, who's hopefully going to be a premium player for you for the next decade. So from that standpoint, you know, it's not all in, but there's also the mindset that, you know, you build your team through the draft. The great franchises in this league are building through the draft. They're finding the premium players each year in the draft. And of course, you know, look, if the Jets trade up, they can get a premium player. But great teams are built on more than one draft pick. You want to make sure you have as many picks as possible, because the great teams, they really go to town, not just in the first round, but in rounds 2, 3, and 4. And if you're talking about moving up, in some ways it is kind of a short-term move, because if you move up in the top 10, the Jets are already picking 10th, but if you move even higher in the top 10, that's the spot where, and there aren't many spots in the draft where you can expect this, but if you move like even higher than 10, that is the spot where you have a really good chance of getting a guy who makes an impact year one. Not just a guy who plays a role for you year one, but a guy who can be an impact player right off the bat. And of course, in the draft, yeah, it draft's a little bit different than free agency. If you go out and buy a player who's older, you know, you're talking about a short-term addition. For the NFL draft in the top 10, you go up and get a player, you move up in the first round, you're talking about a guy who's not only going to be great for you year one, but a guy who's hopefully going to be great for you for the long run. But of course, in the NFL teams are not built on one great player. And again, talking about the teams that are successful in the long run in this league, they really invest in those day 2, early day 3 picks. They make sure that they have plenty of them because you only get one first round pick a year. And it's difficult to build a team around one or two great players. It's difficult when you're constantly short on draft picks because you have 22 starting spots in this league. On top of the 22 starting spots, you also have a number of guys who aren't necessarily starters, but who play critical roles for your team. And those guys are found in rounds 2, 3, and 4. And last year, the Jets did not have a third round pick. They made a couple of trades along the way. They turned one of their third round picks into a second round pick in the Elijah Moore trade, but they also gave away one of their second round picks from Aaron Rodgers. The end result was they ended up down to 3. A couple of years from now, they're going to be down to 3 again because of the Hassan Reddick trade. This year, they're down to 2 already because of the Rodgers trade, another 2 going to Green Bay. So the Jets are already kind of short on picks. So in this context, it's kind of, it is kind of, even though we're talking the NFL draft, even though we're talking about a player you think is probably going to be great for 8 to 10 years, the all-in move might be to move up if that's what you want to do. But I think part of the challenge with this is, and this is part of the challenge I have, and it's why I'm not a huge idea of moving up, within reason. If some team offers the Jets a deal that's too good to be true, of course you take it. If some team, a team sitting at 5 offers the Jets a chance to move up and all they have to give us a 7th round pick, you do it. But at a market rate deal, I think it's gonna be tough. I think it's gonna be tough for the Jets, and part of it's that they have the 10th pick already. If you can't find a great player at 10, what are you doing? And I think sometimes we get ourselves a little too wrapped up in the draft hype. We convince ourselves that there's only like a handful of truly elite players in each year's class, when in reality, there are really great players who are drafted throughout the first round. I actually just wrote an article. It was about Georgia tight end Brock Bowers. I wrote it yesterday on gangreennation.com. And one of the things I found is that guys who are multi-time All-Pros who are drafted in the first round, only half of them go in the top 10. Sometimes there are better players than you think who go later than 10. Sometimes the guys you pick in the top 10 aren't as great as you expect them to be. The draft's very inexact. We act like we have the draft figured out every single year. We act like we know exactly how these prospects are going to turn out. And every single year we're proven wrong. And then we never correct for this. And look, trading up is risky. Trading up is risky from that standpoint. Is that guy you think is a blue chip prospect who is a can't miss? If he misses and you trade up for him and you give up even more picks to get him, you really put yourself behind the 8 ball. And again, 10th overall, that's a spot where you can find a great player. In fact, the Jets could still trade down and get a great player. We've always, every single year, we decide that these are the only blue chip prospects. And every single year, there are guys who are great players who are drafted 10 to 20. There are guys drafted 20 to 32 who end up being great players. And that's why I'm of the mindset that, despite us talking about, being all in, I'm of the mindset that I'd rather see the Jets trade down than trade up because, some of the guys who go later than 10, they're going to be great players. They're going to be guys who are foundational pieces for whatever team drafts them. And I'd like to see the Jets kind of replenish the well. Jets have given up a lot of draft picks the last couple of years. And we can go on and on arguing about whether those were the right moves. But one thing I do know is that when you give up picks, you have to figure out a way to replenish them eventually, or your team's eventually going to be short on talent. So I'm not a fan of it, but it's certainly possible that the Jets could move up this year. And I've kind of laid out why I think I'd rather see them either stay put or trade down. Now, another aspect of the draft strategy are the players already on the team. As we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about how the guys who are already on the roster could impact what the Jets do at 10. That's again continuing this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monopoly Go. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure about you or your team and whether or not you can pull out a win. That's when you dig deep, lift up your head, and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, time to pull off some bank heist and take as much of my friend's money as I possibly can. That's right, the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime, with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. Play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. Make your friends go bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. Charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends if you want to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And if you're a fan of Locked On Jets, you'll be a fan of the Locked On NFL Mock Draft. It's available now. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on Locked On NFL Draft to hear who the local Locked On experts like me are picking for each NFL franchise, with live reactions from local college football experts and even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL Mock Draft, available now on the Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, we're focused on the NFL Draft. It begins a week from today. Jets will be on the clock. Will they be picking 10th? Will they be trade up? Will they trade down? Well, that's a question we'll answer then. Another question, who will the Jets pick? And one thing that could impact that is how the Jets view the players on their roster right now. And there are a couple different ways this could come into play. I think number one is you have to look at players recovering from injury. And first among them, I think, is Mike Williams. Now, it's kind of an interesting because a few weeks back, Robert Saleh gave an update on Mike Williams at the owners' meetings. We talked about it on the show about how he was very optimistic, how they felt like Mike Williams was on a good trajectory. And since then, the Jets have kind of hedged their bets on Williams. And, it's not entirely clear he's going to be ready the first day of training camp. He's coming off a torn ACL. And whether or not Williams is ready, I think actually does have a pretty big impact on whether the Jets focus on a pass catcher or whether they, maybe lean a little bit more towards an offensive lineman. Because if they're not expecting Williams to be ready for week one, suddenly this skill group is looking a lot like it did a year ago, where I guess you're going into the season maybe with Allen Lazard once again as your number 2 receiver if you don't draft somebody. And maybe we're talking Xavier Gipson in the slot. And look, the skill group still has Garrett Wilson. It still has Breece Hall at the running back position. So it's not like, it's not like some of the, the Jets teams of the Mike McCagnon era where you had absolutely nothing at the skill positions. But it gets pretty thin after you get past the top 2 guys if Williams is not ready to go. Now, if Williams is ready to go, suddenly that group looks pretty good. You have Garrett, you have Breece, you have Williams. And, as much as people rightfully bash Lazard because he deserves every bit of the criticism he got, if Lazard's your 3rd receiver, I mean, looking historically through his career, I think that you can live with that. And maybe, I don't know, maybe they like Xavier Gipson in the slot, which, I'm not a big fan of. But, if Williams is ready to go, you have a good 1-2 punch. You have an excellent 1-2 punch. And if you're concerned about him at all, though, that probably pushes you more towards receiver, because you need to, you can't really, it's tough to go into the season. And Jets once again are talking Super Bowl. Jets once again, I mean, nobody will ever accuse the Jets of keeping quiet during the offseason. Nobody will ever accuse the Jets of staying under the radar. Jets are once again talking Super Bowl. They're once again, making noise about, how big their expectations are this coming season. It's difficult to have big expectations, though, with Allen Lazard, your 2nd receiver. And I think like part of what will play into this decision is how concerned they are with Williams. And, if they draft a receiver, I'm not saying it's necessarily a sign that, there's an issue with Williams. I mean, they may just really like the receiver prospects. There are lots of great prospects who could be available by the time they pick. So I'm not, it's not necessarily an indication that they're concerned with Williams. But if they are at all, that could be something that maybe makes you lean a little bit more towards receiver than you would on the offensive line. I think there's also a question with some of the incumbent guys they have. They do have a number of young players, and how they feel about them could impact the pick in other ways as well. And one spot I'm looking at is the offensive line. Now, I don't know that you would pass on a tackle at 10 because of Carter Warren, because you do need to think about the long term. But if we're just talking about this year, I think one of the rationales, maybe not the rationale for picking a tackle is the long term, is finding a starter, because you don't have a starter past this year at either tackle spot. Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, both 33, both in the last year of their contract. Very small chance that both of them are going to be back in 2025. Pretty decent chance neither of them is going to be back for 2025. So you need to think ahead a year. We're not talking 3 years down the line. We're talking 1 year down the line. That's the number one motivation for drafting a tackle. But there's also a short-term motivation, is that both of these guys are older. One of whom, Tyron Smith, is in particular, is a pretty big injury risk. If you feel okay with Carter Warren as a backup, now I don't think the Jets are going to think Carter Warren's a starting material. I don't think that can be their mindset until he proves otherwise. And you hate to say this about day 3 picks, but if you're a day 3 pick, you just have to assume the guy's not going to be a starter until he proves you otherwise. But it's possible to find a quality backup on day 3. And that's what I think what the Jets were trying to do last year when they drafted Warren. And I'll say that unlike Max Mitchell a year ago, like with Max Mitchell, we were having many of the same discussions a year ago, and clearly it doesn't look like it's going to work out. With Max Mitchell, like something had to change about him. Like he had to get stronger. You had to see like some athleticism blossom. Carter Warren, at least, I think, has the tools to conceivably be a quality backup. Will he be? We don't know based on what we saw last year. I mean, most of the time when he was out there last year, he really struggled. He played well, maybe a game or two, so particularly the game against the Commanders, but that was against a lousy pass rush. That was against a team with no edge rushers. Now, to his fairness, he played really well. If he had struggled against a team with no pass rushers, that would be an issue. So maybe you saw a little flicker of hope there. But the question really will be answered over the course of the offseason. Jets will do an internal evaluation of him and figure out whether or not he can stand at the tackle position. And this is the type of thing that I think will have not necessarily be the deciding factor, but on the margins it could make a difference. If you're kind of like up in the air, do we draft a receiver? Do we draft a tackle? If it's like a coin flip, you may ask yourself, how do we feel about Mike Williams? Another question might be, how do we feel about Carter Warren? If we feel Carter Warren can handle it like a few games as a backup tackle, conceivably, that could push you towards drafting a receiver, and you say, you know what, we can't fix all of our long-term issues in one offseason. We'll just focus on tackle, and we'll figure out what we'll do with tackle a year from now. Maybe we can bring Moses back, but we feel okay with Warren as some sort of Smith insurance. Now, that would not necessarily be my interpretation if I were the Jets. I'm not sure I would feel great about going into the season with Carter Warren as the primary backup, but they see him every day. They have a better sense of how he's developing. If they feel like he can hold the spot down, it may make them a little bit more comfortable passing on tackle in the early rounds. And less likely, but I'll throw it out there. I mean, there are a couple young guys, Xavier Gipson and Jason Brownlee. And look, I'm not very high on either of these guys. I'll be honest with you, but for the sake of argument, if they see these guys, especially during the offseason program, and they look like they're really developing, and they think maybe they can handle a role as the number 3 receiver, and that wouldn't be my interpretation. But if they're seeing something there, maybe it makes you feel a little bit more comfortable with what you got at receiver. Maybe you feel like you've got Williams insurance. I mean, probably not, but I guess anything's possible, right? Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a player who's being mocked to the New York Jets a lot, Brock Bowers. We've talked about him a lot on this podcast. I think part of the question with the Jets and Bowers is how good do they think he is? How confident are they in their evaluations? And we'll go into more detail on that continuing this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. When it comes to your financial future, you think you've done it all. You've saved, you've researched, you've invested all that you can. Now you need to take those investments to the next level by using what every financial great uses, Yahoo Finance. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place. They are the number one finance destination, providing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401ks and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination. yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Today we're talking about questions the Jets need to answer in the NFL draft. We're 1 week away from the first round. Jets currently own the 10th overall pick. And over the last couple of weeks, if you've been paying attention, there's been a lot of buzz about Georgia tight end Brock Bowers potentially being the Jets pick at 10th overall. I've spoken a lot about it. If you're an everydayer, maybe you're tired of hearing me talk about Brock Bowers. And if you're an everydayer, you know that I'm not crazy about the idea of the Jets drafting Brock Bowers 10th overall. It doesn't have a lot to do with the player himself. It's mainly about the position. Tight end, I think most people would agree with me when I say it's usually a bad idea to draft a tight end early in the NFL draft, especially in the top 10. There aren't many who go high in the first round, and more often than not, teams look back on it as a mistake, if they're being honest. Most of the great tight ends in this league were not first-round picks. George Kittle was not a first-round pick. Travis Kelce was not a first-round pick. Rob Gronkowski was not a first-round pick. Antonio Gates was an undrafted free agent. I mean, we can go through the list. There aren't a lot of the great tight ends who are drafted in the first round. It's not a position the league does very well. It's not a position the league scouts very well. It feels like every couple of years there's some tight end prospect. They view him as like this next generational prospect. By the way, let's get rid of the word generational. Generational is supposed to be once in a generation, yet every couple of years there's a generational prospect at each position. But every couple of years there's some tight end prospect who's going to redefine the position, and he goes high, and he usually disappoints. The question is whether that's going to be Brock Bowers again. And there's a chance he's not. And we know Joe Douglas has actually talked about this in the past, maybe not so much at the tight end position, but 2 years ago, there was a great safety prospect, Kyle Hamilton, coming out of Notre Dame. And Douglas used the phrase unicorn. He talked about positional value. And if you followed Douglas's Jets career, the first round picks, they've been really focused on the premium positions. You know, you can talk about Mekhi Becton, tackle, 2020. Zach Wilson, 2021, quarterback. Elijah Vera Tucker, I think you can make an argument guard's a premium position. Elijah Vera Tucker, maybe not. Some people would say yes because it's an offensive line spot. I would be one of them. Some people would say no. But 2022, Sauce Gardner, corner. Garrett Wilson, wide receiver. Jermaine Johnson, defensive end. All premium positions. No debate there. 2023, Will McDonald, defensive end. But Douglas mentioned that, you know, sometimes they're willing to make an exception for an exceptional player at a non-premium position. And I think one thing I would say in the NFL is that it's okay to draft a guy at a non-premium position here or there. I think overwhelmingly, strategically, if it's, you know, there are the picks that are made in isolation. You can say you can defend any pick in general, but over the long run, I think most of your picks should be at the premium position. If you're constantly drafting at the non-premium positions, I'm guessing your team's not going to be very good. But every now and then there's a great player at a non-premium position. And I think the question is whether Brock Bowers is that type of player. And if you look at his resume, I will say this, and I'll say this as somebody who's not crazy about drafting Brock Bowers in the first round. There's an argument to be made. You know, extremely productive at Georgia. You look at his skill set. I mean, very fast, a guy who on film certainly, you know, plays with speed, a guy who is tough to bring down in the open field. Look, I'll play devil's advocate. I mean, look, I'm not a fan of this pick. I'm not a fan of the idea of drafting Bowers. But one thing I've said consistently on the show is if he is one of the top tight ends in the NFL, you know, if he becomes a top 3 guy, then he is worth the pick. And that's the challenge, I think, when we're talking about the non-premium positions. Because last year, there were 27 wide receivers who went for 1,000 yards and only one tight end. Now, there were a couple tight ends who came close. A couple tight ends, you know, fell just a shade short of 1,000 yards. There were also a couple tight ends who were between 800 and 900 yards. But again, 27 wide receivers. So if you don't draft an elite wide receiver in the first round, but you draft a guy like a Garrett Wilson, perfect example. Garrett Wilson's not on anybody's top 5 wide receivers list. You know, you probably not on many people's top 10 wide receivers list, but still a great player. If Bowers is not a top 10 tight end, and you draft him 10th overall, you know, that's a really, really tough pick to justify. Bowers, I mean, does he need to be Kittle? Does he need to be Kelce? I mean, I don't know that he needs to be quite that good, but he needs to be one of the best tight ends in the NFL. In a way, a wide receiver would not need to be one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. In a way, a defensive end would not need to be one of the best defensive ends in the NFL. You know, you get a guy like a Jermaine Johnson. Is Jermaine Johnson a top 10 defensive end in the league? Of course not. I know he made the Pro Bowl, but let's be serious. There are clearly 10 defensive ends you take over Jermaine Johnson. But he looks like a very good pick. And I understand that was lower than 10. But even if you picked Jermaine at 10 and got Pro Bowl production, 7.5 sacks, excellent run defense, I think you'd be pretty happy with that. You can't be happy with anything other than top tight end production for Brock Bowers. The question is whether or not you can get it. The question is also whether or not it's something that's predictable. I do think that there's a case to be made. I actually laid it out in an article I wrote yesterday on GangGreenNation.com that predicting elite is very difficult to do. Predicting good in the NFL is not that hard to do. Teams do it pretty well. Predicting elite, go back to what I said earlier about how half the guys who were multi-time All-Pros picked in the first round did not go in the top 10. Picking the creme de la creme, not so easy. And something that, you know, teams I think should be a little bit should have a little bit more humility when they talk about their assessments. But if the Jets believe Brock Bowers is truly the exception, if they believe he is the next great tight end in the NFL, well, we know great tight ends are matchup nightmares. You know, the guys who run like receivers, but are built like linebackers. I keep seeing people say, well, the tight end position is on the rise because they just create so many matchup problems. Well, part of the reason they create so many matchup problems, there aren't many great tight ends in the league. Yeah, if there was a flood of 240, 250, 260 pound guys who ran 4 5 40s, yeah, the tight end position would be on the rise. There aren't many of them though. And that takes me to a concept that was popularized by the late Giants general manager George Young in the 1980s. It was called the Planet Theory, and it was about drafting offensive and defensive linemen. And the theory was that there are only so many big guys who are really athletic built on the planet. And if you have the chance to draft one of them, you do it. Well, thinking about the tight end position, there are only so many matchup nightmares who are available, and they don't come around every year. We talk every couple of years. There's this tight end who's going to revolutionize the league, and frequently they don't. But not every year you have a chance to draft a matchup nightmare because there really aren't that many tight ends who make a genuine difference. And when you find them, they are the Kelsey types, they are the Kittle types, they are the Gronk types, they're the Antonio Gates types, the Tony Gonzalez types, guys who just create matchup problems. You have the opportunity to draft them. There's a case to be made. I'm not sure I would make it, but I understand the argument. And week from tonight, we'll have a sense of whether the Jets think Brock Bowers is that kind of guy. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.